Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television show. My guest today is Roger Chartier, who's here to discuss his books, On the Edge of the Cliff, History, Language and Practices, and Forms and Meanings. Roger, many historians in this country regard you as one of the French intellectuals, similar to people like Sartre, Bordeaux, or Foucault, deconstructionists, because you're having such an impact on how we think about history. Could you share with us some of the specific work you've done and what historical problems you've addressed in your work?
First of all, I thank you for your invitation. I have also to apologize for my chaotic English, and I think it's exaggeration, this comparison, agreeable exaggeration, but nevertheless an exaggeration. I think that if this possible an exaggerated comparison arises, it's because for me the work by an historian has two dimensions. One dimension is to be able to have some expertise in a specific field in order to make more intelligible some problems, some texts, some social practices. In my case, this field is a relationship between the text, the books, and all the form of their transmission, diffusion, and what people have done with this text. That is to say, an history of the user's interpretation, appropriation of the written word. And mainly for a period which is called by the historians early modern period, 16th, 18th century. At the same time, it seems to me that the historian has to participate in a wider debate about not only what are the principles which can organize and govern a scientific approach of the past of the authors, but more than this, to participate in a more public civic debate about what are the possibilities for history to propose instruments to anyone for understanding his own or her own condition, the world in which he or she is, and also to have a relationship with the past, controlled and useful. So these two elements, one more philosophical, theoretical, epistemological, the other one more empirical and factual, seems to me to define what is the work of an historian today. In this sense, the work by Bourdieu, the French sociologist, or Michel Foucault has something inspiring, because always they thought about the possible intervention in the public sphere on the basis of their expertise for some problems. And perhaps here we have a figure of intellectual very different of the figure from Sartre, which was like Voltaire. He thought it was possible for a philosopher to intervene in any problem, for any question, and with a global view of the society, of the humanity. It seems to me that now the intellectual try to link what they can say in the public space with their proper specific expertise in the domain of knowledge.
In your book, Forms and Meanings, you look at the processes and dynamics producing discourse and at the media used to transmit it, whether it's codex, book, computer, electronic media like the internet. And now as we approach the dawn of a new millennium, along with what you call the electronic revolution of tomorrow, what are your thoughts about the implications this revolution will have for scholarly discourse as this revolution unfolds, or to use the terms electronic media technology boots up?
Yeah, I think that the historians have exaggerated another revolution in the transmission of the written culture, that is to say the invention by Gutenberg at the end of the 15th century of the printing press and the composition with types. Because in this case, the book, the structure of the book was not changed. Gutenberg changed the possibility for reproducing text, but the books before Gutenberg and after Gutenberg has exactly the same fundamental structure. Leaves folded, the pages, and a relationship between the book and the reader, or between the reader and the book, which was not fundamentally, morphologically changed by the fact you shift from the manuscript copy to the printed book. Now, with the electronic text, we have a revolution much more important, because it's not only a revolution in terms of the possibility to produce or reproduce text, it's also a revolution in the vehicle of the text. The structure of the electronic text on the screen and in the computer is not at all the same than the structure of the text in a book, manuscript, or printed. It's the reason why it seems to me the only possible and acceptable comparison with the present is this first revolution at the beginning of the Christian era, when the book of the antiquity, the scroll, was replaced by the codex, the books inherited by Gutenberg and by ourselves until more recently. So we have to think historically, philosophically, sociologically on the impact, the effect of this revolution I call of the tomorrow, but in fact it's of now, and with some differences according to the different civilizations or the different countries. But this revolution is taking place without perhaps a clear consciousness on the effect, what is possible, what is required, what is suppressed by this new form of transmission and reception of the text. This is linked with something more general, that is to say, we cannot think of or study the text, the literature, for example, without taking into account the effect produced by the form, the vehicle which transmitted this text to the readers. It's not at all the same thing to read a novel in the 19th century in a newspaper, or in a book for a reading society, or in the complete work by the same author. The different setting of the same text with quotation marks create open and at the same time limit the possibility for its understanding. So the reflection on the present is directly linked for me to this perception, often forgotten by the literary criticism, of the fact that the text does not exist outside forms, vehicle, materialities, included the materiality of the voice, when the text is transmitted by a recitation or by a performance or by a reading aloud. We have, if we want to understand how people constructed meaning for the text they appropriated, we have to reconstruct the effect, possibilities, and limit of every one of these forms of transmission of the textual culture. And the challenge of the present is to try to do this for the transformation brought by the electronic transmission and reception of text.
At your lecture yesterday, excuse me, at the University of Michigan, you were talking about how all these different elements, the author and the media and the reader, all affect the meaning, or you have to take that into account. And particularly, you've been quite sensitive to how the reader receives the message or understands it or misunderstands it.
No, you're absolutely right. It's the reason why an history of reading, an history of the practices of reading, with all the historical transformation and sociological differences, is necessary. Also an history of the vehicles of the textual culture, and an history of the text read clearly. It's a reason why we can illustrate. I mentioned this example of the 19th century and the same novel by Balzac or Zola, with all the different forms of its transmission. And it's not the same thing to read a novel entirely in a book in which you have the beginning and the end, and to read the same novel in the form of a serial publication, in which you have to expect to wait the day after or the week after to know what happened in the plot. So it's very simple. small, but it seems to be a clear example. For the early modern period, I'm particularly interested in the transmission of the plays, because here you have a series of situations. You have the play performed and the play read. You have the plays performed at the court in France, in England, and the plays performed in the cities, Paris, London, Madrid. And you have, when you are dealing with the printed edition, different form, with or without an image, which can orient the interpretation by the reader, or with or without stage direction, or with some form or other form of punctuation. All these details, finally, forgotten by the great history of literature, are fundamental, it seems to me, in order to reconstruct the production of meaning for different readers, different listeners, different spectators in the past or in the present vis-à-vis the same text. But we see that the same text is only an abstraction, because the text is never the same.
One of the things that was interesting in both books is that you are interested in the complexity of the factors influencing it, but you do not follow people like Hayden White, who argue it's all relative, the interpretation.
Yeah, it's another aspect of this relationship between history and fiction. Until now, we talk about the way through which an historian can apprehend fictional text and to propose a reading, an interpretation of the Shakespeare play or Molière's play in their historical setting, in order to approach what the different publics, the different audiences have understood of this play at the moment of their first productions. What you suggest is to think also about the reverse, that is to say, history as fiction, not history of fiction, but history as fiction. And you mentioned correctly that in the last year, some scholars, as Hayden White, try to say, and in this dimension, this aspect they are right, in my opinion, that history and fiction share the same rhetorical figure and the same narrative structure. And even if the historian proclaim that they have broken with the fiction, in fact they construct their narratives according the unconscious or conscious use of the same rhetorical and narrative figure than a novelist. But the problem starts after this diagnosis, because is it a reason to say that the knowledge produced by history is identical to the knowledge produced by a novel, or are we to establish something specific in terms of the historical knowledge? If you accept the first your proposition, it's clear that it's a path open to relativism. All the narrative are acceptable, and there is no criteria for saying that one is truer than another. In this sense, Hayden White is obliged to limit the criteria of truth or falsification only to fact. You can establish that Napoleon has lived or not. But immediately, on the basis of this fact proven, when you construct a narrative, there is no more criteria for this discrimination. Many historians, and I belong to this current, try to reform now a kind of epistemological, scientific statute for history, with a great tension, because it's not easy to think about a discipline in which there is something scientific, because there are technical, critical operations for constructing the narrative and for constructing before the narrative the object, the instruments for the analysis, the hypothesis, and also in which we have control shared by the community of the historians. On one side, a certain type of objectivity linked with the critical instruments and the collective control of the knowledge produced by history. On the other side, it's clear that history is open to a plurality of interpretations, and in this sense it belongs more to a tradition of hermeneutics. You have possibility for disagreement, but within the possible acceptance, the legitimate acceptance of this different narrative. How to reconcile, to articulate this new definition of objectivity with this respect of the plurality of interpretation. It seems to me it's one of the main problems for historical knowledge, but the aim of this is to maintain that the knowledge produced by the social science, history, sociology, anthropology, is not reducible to the knowledge produced by a fiction, even if fiction produces knowledge. So this reflection, you can, in order to develop this reflection, you can find the help of books like the book by Joyce Appleby, Margaret Jacob, and Lynn Hunt, Telling the Truth About History, or the reflection by Carlo Ginzburg. There is different attempts to produce this new foundation for history as knowledge, at the same time that we have to recognize that history is writing, that is to say, fiction.
So it could give an additional dimension, but it's not a operating principle of itself in or the historical, the science of history.
But it was a more traditional definition of history, finally, to provide an accurate knowledge of the past. And except for the historian in the Middle Ages or early modern period who thought of history as a way for prizing the prince or for constructing the narrative of the nation with ideological determination, since the 16th century with the Renaissance criticism, historical criticism, and in the 18th century with the project of the Enlightenment, and in the 19th century with the academic history. The project of history as a knowledge differentiated from the fiction was fundamental. The difficulty arose recently because the historians were conscious that this knowledge was framed, was expressed through rhetorical and narrative structure which govern the writing of history as the writing of fiction. Until this moment, the narrative dimension of history was erased. And if you are thinking about the history in the 19th century, there was like a coincidence between the past and the discourse on the past. In the 20th century, there was like a scientific model which excluded any reflection on the narrative dimensions, and which tried to construct history on the basis of statistics, quantitative data, the same techniques than some of the natural sciences. So the reflection on the narrative dimension of the writing of history has introduced the doubt, has introduced a challenge, and now the challenge is how to maintain and to refound this first fundamental primordial definition of history as knowledge, since in a moment in which we know that its knowledge is a knowledge expressed as a difference, for example, for mathematics, with the resources of the writing of fiction.
Both of your books we're discussing here, Forms and Meaning and On the Edge of the Cliff, indicate you see language as a bridge to inform our understanding of our perceptions of events as they transpire. But you do so in ways that indicate the need to comprehend the greater depth and complexity, such as what you were saying. I think that's one of the values maybe that the French intellectuals have had for history, is this concern with language.
Mm-hmm. Here too, there is two different ways which can be established on the basis of this importance given to language. On one side, since the language is never transparent to the reality it designates or describes, it's possible, and some people have done it, to think that there is a kind of linguistic determinations. The meaning of a text, the meaning of a work is inscribed in the linguistic functioning impersonal, automatic of language. And finally, neither the writer nor the reader are very important. What is important is the instability of the meaning produced by this internal functioning of the language within the work. And we can say that the constructionist criticism, the Derrida's perspective, is based upon this linguistic model, which create, when you analyze a text, a direct relationship between this unstable production of meaning within the work by the linguistic elements and the critique, which is able to interpret and to make visible this automatic and impersonal functioning of language. It's not my position. I think that even we have to accept that the language is neither objective nor transparent to the reality it's aimed at. At the same time, what we have to think is how the different actors in which cooperate in the process of the production of the text and of the production of the meanings are dealing with their linguistic resources with what the work propose. When the necessity to reintroduce the construction of the figure and of the action of the author, or the intent, the figure and the intent of the author, but also the role played by all the people who were the mediators between a work written by an author and the text read or listened to by an audience, that is to say, the people in the printing shop, the company, the theatrical company, who interpret also the text, giving it a form, a performed form or a printed form, and which bring into this operation of composition of the text or performance of the play their own relationship with the language. And finally, the reader or the spectator, which on the basis of their competencies, abilities, codes, convention, interest, can receive and appropriate the text. So this second way of thinking about the language, it's a way which suppose that a text is a result in its creation, transmission, and interpretation of a multiplicity of decisions, of actions, of operations. And it opened a questionnaire for literary criticism or text cultural history, in which you have to bring together different expertise, the analysis of the text in the different form of the literary criticism, or the history of the book, or a kind of social and cultural history of the publics, of the audiences, and their receptions. So in this sense, when you say complexity, yes, it seems to me that we have to replace this direct dialogue between the linguistic functioning of the text and the interpretation of the literary critique. We have to substitute to this direct relationship the precise analysis of these operations, actors, meanings, which were constructing in the process of its diffusion and reception the work itself.
Those nuances of meaning or shades of differentiation between them is very important. And of course, when we talk about language, we have to talk about your latest book, On the Edge of the Cliff, and what a magnificent foray into theory. And looking at history and discourse is, as you say in the book, a difficult, unstable enterprise posed on the edge of the void.
It's an image I took from Michel de Certeau when he commented upon the book by Foucault, Surveiller et Punir. And the first instability at the edge of the cliff was for any form of history which tried to grasp and interpret, analyze practices which are not discursive practices, the behavior, the gesture, the manner of being or doing. And for an historian, it's on the edge of the cliff because these practices are in general graspable only through texts or images which have described them, but every time with a specific intention to forbid, to impose. And the historians is trying to produce this analysis and to transmit it to the readers through another textuality, his own text. So the tension is between practices which are not organized according to the logic of discourse and which are graspable and analyzable only thanks to and through the reality of discourse. We can have a series of tensions which seems to me clearly designated by this wonderful image of the edge of the cliff, something unstable, but unstable because there is a tension, and you can perhaps avoid to fall from this cliff by mobilizing intellectual resources, analytical tools, which permit to maintain oneself on the edge and not to be at the bottom.
I thought it was nice also that you have a very closely worked out analysis of a number of people, including the dead, as you say, talking with the dead. But really, there's quite a constellation of people that you've carefully considered as you've worked these ideas through. And I thought that was quite nice. It also seemed as though that was part of what that was your duty or something like that, or your responsibility in presenting this theory. It was a very nice way to do it. And we want to thank you for taking time to come and appear on the program. And you had told me earlier that you were on the original Apostrophe in Paris, and that's the model for this program. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.